Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and for this show on Dollars and Cents, I'm going to talk about power. And like a lot of subjects, their power is best approached obliquely. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a series of stories or thoughts that I've had about it in my life, and perhaps share with you some understandings about this rather extraordinary subject. I think my first experience with power in a public way was in high school. I was elected student body president under very strange circumstances. I wasn't the kind of kid to run for student body office, not at all. But in my junior year, the senior class, which was a rather unique class for very strange reasons, they had as we approached their graduation, the football players decided to come on a senior hat day, and some of them had empty beer cans on their heads for hats. All right? This is 1961 in a suburb of California. They show up this beautiful brand new high school that we had, relatively new, and with empty beer cans on their heads. Forthwith, the school principal sent out the dean of boys to gather them up, and we saw this happening. We heard about it, and before lunch, the news came out. They had all been expelled. Now, you know, I mean, we're just kids. This is 1969. I was probably 17 years old, and hearing that these kids were they were just dumb football players wearing empty beer cans in the head, it was a little severe. And what happened was quite interesting. To protest this, somebody organized something, probably the most successful protest I have ever been involved in my life. Now, this is 1961. I was going to go through the 60s. I was going to see a lot of protest. And I can only say that probably in retrospect, that first protest gave me an unwarranted sense of accomplishment of what could happen. Nothing, no protest since then has been as effective as this one was. What somebody decided to do was to protest this act of tyranny by the school administration. What we should do is boycott the school cafeteria. It was spring. It was a virtually brand new high school. We had rolling green lawns, and the food in the cafeteria wasn't all that good. So we just started bringing our lunches from home, sitting out in the springtime and eating lunch. And what we didn't know, but now I know, was every day those cooks, the food prep people hired by the school, would cook the food that they had already ordered and paid for in time for lunch. The food vats were filled, and no one came in. And at the end of the day, they would take those vats full of food and dump them. Now, they never had to do this before because they already sold it. Always sold it. Now they didn't. This went on, and the tension in the school started building. Well, what happened is that my sister told me, she said, "Why don't you run for student body president?" And so, not knowing better, I did. But I was to learn an extraordinary lesson from it. Well, so when you ran for student body president, they had a speech day. We were supposed to give our speeches before the student body. And so I, along with everybody else, wrote out our speeches. And the administration wanted to see them. So they asked for our speeches. We all turned them in. And everybody got their speech back except me. Now, I didn't know why. That's how naive I was. But I found out on the day of the assembly why they had taken my speech. They handed my speech back to me that morning, and the high school had a little over 2,000 kids in it. And so I got up to give my speech. And I stood up, and I analyzed what had gone down to the school. This is 1961, California suburb. And I said these words: "What we need is student power." That auditorium exploded. Every one of those kids hit their feet and started cheering. I was shocked. This, however, was, I'm sure in retrospect, the school administration's greatest fear. I was elected student body president, showed up next year, assumed my, quote, duties. I'm the president, whatever that is, all right? The first bill of business that we were supposed to do is a swimming pool. Now, this is a beautiful high school, rolling lawns, 1961, and we were supposed to approve the funds from the student body for this big swimming pool for, racing or whatever kids did, with all those diving platforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the first time I'd seen it. What we were supposed to do was just rubber stamp it and say, okay, take a vote and give them the money. Well, I was so dumb. I thought, I had never heard of this before. I said, well, this is a lot of money. Maybe we should study this. I found out that was the wrong thing. This was my first experience with real power. My experience with real power was you're supposed to do what they want you to do. I didn't know this. And in the abeyance of having been in this office, I would never have known it. What the powerful are supposed to do or the ostensibly powerful when they're in office. They are there to do what you're supposed to do. I didn't want to do it, at least not then, and I found the pressure was, you're supposed to do it. It was an extraordinary entree into the world of power. And that's what I want to talk about through these different areas. One of the things that just recently came up with what you may be aware about is the largest bank in the world, HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, was hit with a $1.9 billion fine for money laundering. That's a lot of money. And not only was the fine large, but the charges were egregious. That for the last 10 years, HSBC had helped the drug cartels out of Mexico launder hundreds of millions of dollars, launder terrorist funds all around the globe, where they were at it. All right? Now what happened was, when this hit the news, all of a sudden, no charges were filed. They allowed the bank to get off with a $1.9 billion fine, and the president of the bank said, oh, I'm sorry, we won't do this again. I don't know how it happened. And that was it. And then the outcry started. You let off a bank, the largest bank in the world nonetheless, with a $1.9 billion fine with no criminal charges. This is money laundering at the highest level. And I'm sure you have all heard about how our government talks about money laundering. Eric Holder, all these people talking about money laundering, the evils of money laundering. Well, the question began asked, why didn't you bring charges against any of these people? No heads rolled. They were given a $1.9 billion fine, which HSBC could write off on its taxes as a business expense for the next year. Estimated profits from the money laundering were $22 billion. I mean, a 10% loss? That's not bad, is it? All right? Not bad at all. So what happened was that Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, was called to the carpet for this. Why were no criminal charges? I mean, after all, nobody in Wall Street has gone to jail for what they've done. And now, the largest bank, no one's going to even get their hands slapped for this. Not even a real criminal investigation. What gives? And Eric Holder goes, well, it's too big to fail. I mean, the bank was too big. If the bank went down, it would shake, it would be too big. It would shock the system. Well, I want to tell you something. The American public was sold that false story in 2008, 2009 with the TARP bailout. And if you want to find out the real story on the TARP bailout, you might want to read a book by David Stockman called The Great Deformation. David Stockman was the director of the budget under Ronald Reagan. He's a Wall Streeter, a Republican, a venture capitalist, and he said it was a lie. If we had not bailed out Wall Street, the banks would have taken a hit, which they should have for their bad bets. Everything would have been stable after that. There would have been a few shakes, but nothing like happened later. The banks walked away scot-free, made whole by the U.S. taxpayers. And the story stuck. Too big to fail. Eric Holder, in response to the failure of the United States Attorney General to bring any charges against HBSC and its officers, said, oh, they're too big. They're too big. I want to tell you, it wasn't about money. It wasn't about the threat to the financial system. It was power. These people are too powerful. These banks have been engaging in money laundering for 20 years. And there was a book. I have a story. This book here, Light in a Dark Place. And I wrote about money laundering. This was during my years in prison. And recently a reader of mine wrote. He watches these TV programs, and he said that he was going to buy a book, Light in a Dark Place. And so I decided, I said, listen, I want to give you a little backstory on how that book was written. In 1983, a friend of mine had called me, and he said, Darryl, I want you to read this metaphysical book called Thinking and Destiny. Well, and I'm reading this book, and it said, your use of thought to create your reality is an inappropriate use of your power at this time. Power at this time. Because much of what you learn comes through adversity. And you're using this power to keep those learning situations away from you that you need. Well, I had been turned on to the use of thought, which we call positive thinking. Napoleon Hill wrote in his book, Think and Grow Rich, one of the biggest selling books in the history of America. And a friend of mine had turned me on to a book called The Lazy Man's Way to Riches, which focused this power of thought. He became a multimillionaire, and I, a dirt-broke hippie, was retired by 1976. So I learned about the power of thought. And all of a sudden, I get this advice that I'm using this power inappropriately at this time. Because much of what I learned is to come from hardship, through adversity. Well, to me, in retrospect, I said, it's like somebody turned off the exit signs in my life. Somebody locked the exit doors. What was I going to do? And certainly, in the next year when my money started going out faster than it was coming in, my usual backup thing was to do my affirmations, close my eyes, imagine abundance, prosperity, and all that, and it would come back. But I now knew, or was told, I shouldn't do it. So I closed my eyes, and I wasn't going to not do this just, like easily. So I said, can I use affirmations? The answer was no. I threw the I Ching. Can I use affirmations? The answer was no. I get busted in the biggest, I was to get 10 years in prison. That was my next learning lesson. And this is the book I wrote of my prison stories. In this book is a story about a lady in Oakland. And her car was seized by by the Oakland police because she was a black lady. This case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Her boyfriend had taken her car without her knowing it. She's working. He went out somewhere and he bought some crack. Well, unfortunately for him, the crack dealer was busted, he was busted, and they took her car. All right? Now, the attorneys for this lady go, hey, it's her car. She didn't know it. She had no idea what he was doing. You can't take her car. This case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And they ruled that anything used in a drug situation is subject to seizure because of the importance of the drug cases involved in the United States. They caught her car. She couldn't get the damn car back because of a ruling by the United States Supreme Court. Well, I happen to know that around this period of time, Raul Salinas, the president of Mexico, had hightailed it to Ireland because they didn't have an extradition treaty, and his brother was imprisoned in Mexico for laundering hundreds of millions of dollars through Citibank in New York of cash money from drug trade. And Citibank not only had done it, the feds knew about it. And I thought, wow, now we're going to see Citibank seized like this poor lady's car in Oakland was seized. The statutes are there, the laws are there, the social necessity for draconian messages, actions are there. I mean, we got to put an end to drug dealing. Not a Twitter. Nothing happened. Nobody in Citicorp went to jail. Not even a fine. Nothing. And the lady in Oakland never got her car back. All right? Rather interesting. So when you think about justice, I want to think what you think about justice and the reality of justice and power. All right? We have a constitution. We have laws. I want to read you something that I wrote in here about Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia. It's a wonder that the name Justice Scalia can be put together. It's an oxymoron. I want to read you what I wrote in my book, Light in a Dark Place, about Scalia. In 1991, Antonin Scalia, a right-wing Republican appointee to the Supreme Court, denied a new trial for a young black man sentenced to over 20 years for possessing a small amount of rock cocaine. They appealed his sentence on the grounds that this was cruel and unusual punishment, which was prohibited by the U.S. Constitution. Scalia wrote that although the 20-year sentence may indeed be cruel, such sentences in America are not unusual. Isn't that wonderful? A 20-year sentence for a small amount of rock cocaine may indeed be cruel, but he denied the appeal on the basis that such sentences in America were not unusual. I wrote these words: Scalia, you are heartless in your black Supreme Court robes, for you served the darker forces that persecuted Job. But with your Latin learning and your law books at your side, you will someday face your judgments. From God you cannot hide. For Christ himself said those words, that you will someday know that as you do to the least of men, you do to him also. Being in prison taught me many things. And one of the things it taught me were the brothers. I didn't know many black people. I had friends, but not on the level when most of them were black. I mean, when you're around black people, and there's a lot of them, they're real different than around those of us who aren't black. And I got to know them. I was recently on a trip to Korea and was surrounded by black ministers. They were wonderful. They rolled, they laughed, they poked fun at each other. Well, prison, it wasn't quite that party, but they were real different in prison, and I got to appreciate who they were. And I wrote this rap, this poem, quote, poem when I was in prison, and I entered it later in 2005 on a whim to the Austin City Songwriters Contest. Now, Austin is a big music center, and I sent this rap in, and I took first place in 2005. And it came from my experience of knowing the brothers, the black kids in prison. They were doing extremely long sentences in federal prison. This is the rap. The brothers are down, locked up and slammed by the cold motherfuckers who rule this land, who say they care about liberty, but you know it hurts them if a brother goes free. What chance they got, these brothers from town, in a world so cold it puts them down for who they are and look and feel. But deep inside, they know they're real. But where's this got them in a world so cold? They now got attitudes raw and bold, where they're acting tough, being gangster dudes, rough and ready, and mean and rude, and carrying guns and feeling no fear, intimidating, pressing beyond their years. They know the streets, not books and schools. They know for them there ain't no rules, because the cold motherfuckers who run the game are going to make sure they take the blame for all that's wrong in society. The new fall guys, they won't let free, because the old cold motherfuckers are doing their best to jail them up and kill the rest. But the brothers are real. They've got love and heart, and I'm waiting for them to play their part in God's great plan for this world of ours, when we'll all be free of prisons and bars. But now ain't then, and the times are bad, and the brothers you know are being had, because life on the streets is suicide, and going that way is one hard ride. So I'm watching it all like a TV show, and I tell myself, I'd like to know that it's going to turn out so the brothers will be moving and popping and finally free. But the cold motherfuckers have lots of power, and it may not be the brothers' hour. So I sit here on my prison bed and hope the brothers can keep their heads and make it through these hard-ass days, because the cold motherfuckers have got their ways. I was to learn a lot of things in prison. Spiritual experiences far beyond I expected. I started meditating in prison seriously. I wasn't quite the guy on the weight pile, but I started meditating. And meditating not because of where I wanted to go. I was meditating where I wanted to leave. And unexpected to me, stunningly, I had a stunning spiritual experience that I wrote about in Light in a Dark Place. Power is an interesting thing. And I had to be divested of all temporal power so I could learn what true power is. And that's what came to me in that 10-year prison sentence. Things happened. I learned things I never would have learned on the outside. That's why when I see HSBC, Eric Holder, the Department of Defense, the United States Department of the Military, what they're doing, I look at it all with a grain of objectivity, subjective objectivity, because I know their power is not the real power. And I didn't know it when I went in. I want to read you an essay that I wrote when I was there. It was called Journeys. Here I was, a hippie in jail, finally, at the end. Now, where is it? I wrote this in 1989. I was halfway through my prison trip. Journeys. Life itself can be described as a journey, and although it is not always a vacation, it certainly is always a trip. My own journey had taken me far from the scenes of my childhood. In the 1950s, and amongst the flat and endless stretches of tract and custom homes, Tower Records and Shakey's Pizza Parlor, I and many others gestated in prototypical suburban petri dishes throughout the United States. There, Little League, piano lessons, two-car garages, and yearly subscriptions to National Geographic and Sunset magazines were to be, however, inadequate portents or preparations for what was to be. The 1960s, an era that caught everyone unawares, would erupt from a somnambulism that would give no warning. To journey, however, one need not be forewarned, one need only to go. Go I did. At the time, this going seemed less by choice than by circumstance. Now I know time and circumstance are predetermined by fate. Then I did not. The journey, beginning in the raw ignorance of American suburbia, was to take me through the self-righteous anger and bitterness of the anti-war era, through much of the phenomena that were to affect or afflict this nation's then youth. Had I known then the journey's itinerary, I would not have started. However, I did not, so I did go, and now, having gone, regret nothing of what the journey had to teach. Travel to faraway places was not high on the agenda of my youth. But then again, the agenda of my generation was a hidden one, and irrespective of what we perhaps hoped it to be, it was to turn out differently. Shattered marriages, drugs that opened, drugs that closed, and hopes rising only to fall, leaving behind a darkness intensified by the light which had preceded it, was nothing we had expected or wanted. How would I have known then, or even imagined, that someday I would mount a camel on the Great Wall of China, or watch in horror as a San Francisco tactical squad chased and brutally beat defenseless hippies, and then walk past that same squad 15 years later when invited to the mayor's reception for the president of France, and remember that scene of rage and fear from years before. Inner Mongolia, Marrakesh, Morocco, presidential invitations and waist chains and leg irons on the way to federal prison were all to be a part of what lay ahead, at least for me. These were events and places unimaginable to a teenage boy growing up in the suburbs of the 1950s. A world as buttressed against chaos as was the palace of the Buddha's boyhood. But like his world, that world too was to disintegrate in the face of forces our parents strove with all their might and power to keep out. But what else could not be imagined was that out of that chaos, out of that disintegration, would evolve a peace and power as unexpected as it was initially unsought. It is only lately I have realized that the journey of our generation is not yet over. In truth, it has only just begun. Power is not just that which comes from the words of a judge. Power ultimately is that which comes from he who does not judge.